The grand hotel ballroom was filled with the kind of expensive silence that only money can buy. It was a Tuesday evening, and the air inside the room smelled of polished furniture, expensive cologne, and fresh flowers. The huge crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling cast a bright, sparkling light over the crowd. Everywhere you looked, there were people dressed in their finest clothes. The men wore dark suits that fit perfectly, and the women wore dresses that sparkled under the lights. They were all holding glasses of champagne, talking in low voices about their businesses, their houses, and their vacations. They were the kind of people who were used to getting what they wanted, and tonight, what they wanted was music. At the front of the room, there was a massive black grand piano. It sat alone on the stage, shining like a mirror. Sitting at the piano was Julian Thorne. Julian was famous all over the world. He was known as a genius, a man who could make the piano sing and cry. He was also known for being difficult. He didn't like people talking while he played, and he didn't like mistakes. His face was always serious, almost cold, as he focused entirely on the keys. He played with speed and power, his fingers flying across the ivory like they had a mind of their own. The music was loud and fast and impressive. It showed off his skill, but it didn't have much warmth. It was music meant to be admired, not felt. The audience watched him like hawks. When he finished a difficult song, they clapped politely. They clapped because they knew they were supposed to, because they were watching a celebrity. But they didn't really feel moved. They were just waiting to see what he would do next. Julian finished a song with a loud, dramatic chord and let his hands fall into his lap. The room erupted in applause. Julian stood up, gave a small, stiff bow, and sat back down. He wiped his forehead with a white handkerchief. He was tired, but he was also feeling very full of himself. He looked out at the crowd and saw their admiring faces. He felt like he owned the room. It was during this short break that Julian's eyes started to wander around the room. He was bored with the attention of the rich people. He wanted something to amuse himself. That was when he noticed her. In the corner of the ballroom, far away from the bright stage lights, was a woman named Martha. Martha was not rich. She was not famous. She was the hotel cleaner. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun and kind lines etched around her eyes. She was wearing a simple blue uniform that had seen better days. On her feet were comfortable, worn-out walking shoes. In her hands, she held a feather duster and a soft cloth. She was quietly wiping down a wooden display cabinet, trying her best to be invisible. She didn't want to disturb the guests. She just wanted to do her job and go home. Julian watched her for a moment. A mischievous idea formed in his head. He saw the way she moved slowly and carefully. He saw her simple clothes and her tired posture. He thought it would be funny to mix her world with his. He leaned forward and tapped the microphone, making a sharp screeching noise that made everyone jump. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said. His voice was smooth and clear. "I have been playing for you for an hour. My fingers are getting tired." The crowd laughed lightly. They thought he was joking. "I think I need a break," Julian continued, looking around the room. "I see someone over there who looks like she knows exactly what to do with a piano." He pointed a long finger directly at Martha in the corner. The spotlight operator, confused but obedient, turned the bright beam of light away from Julian and onto Martha. Suddenly, Martha wasn't invisible anymore. She was standing in a blinding circle of white light. She froze, her cloth still in her hand. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights. The crowd turned their heads to look at her. A few people chuckled. They thought Julian was setting up a comedy act. "Please, come here," Julian said, waving his hand. "Don't be shy." Martha shook her head slightly. She wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. She didn't like attention. But Julian insisted. "Come, come. The stage is open." Feeling the pressure of 100 eyes on her, Martha slowly put her cleaning supplies on a table. She smoothed down the front of her uniform and began to walk toward the stage. Her footsteps echoed on the marble floor. As she got closer to the stage, the contrast between her and the room became even sharper. The grand piano was sleek and expensive. Martha was small and simple. Her shoes made a soft squeaking sound as she walked up the 3 steps to the stage. Julian stood up from the bench and moved to the side with a flourish, like a magician revealing a trick. He bowed low and gestured for Martha to sit. The piano bench was high and slippery. Martha sat down carefully. Her feet didn't quite touch the gold pedals. She felt very small in front of the enormous instrument. The audience was giggling now. They were waiting for her to do something silly. They expected her to maybe hit a wrong note on purpose or to make a joke about not knowing how to play. It was a cruel joke, but it was the kind of entertainment these people enjoyed. Julian leaned against the side of the piano, crossing his arms. He looked down at Martha with a smirk. He was enjoying this. He thought he was the king of the castle, and he had brought a peasant in to amuse the court. "So," Julian said into the microphone, looking down at her. "Show us what you can do. Play something for us." Martha looked at the keys. They were white and black and looked very clean. She placed her hands on her lap. She looked out at the crowd, but all she saw was a blur of faces and diamonds. She felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She knew why she was there. She knew they were laughing at her, not with her. She wanted to run back to her cabinet and finish dusting, but her legs felt like lead. She was trapped in the light. Julian checked his watch, pretending to be bored. "Any time now," he teased. The room went quiet, waiting for the punchline. But Martha didn't move to get up. She didn't tell a joke. Instead, she took a deep breath. She let the air fill her lungs slowly. She closed her eyes for a second and seemed to forget about the hundreds of people staring at her. She forgot about Julian standing over her. In her mind, she was no longer in a fancy hotel ballroom. She was just sitting at a piano. She lifted her hands. They were rough hands, hands that had scrubbed floors and washed dishes for 40 years. Her knuckles were a bit swollen, and her skin was dry. They were not the soft, manicured hands of a concert pianist. As she hovered her fingers over the keys, Julian rolled his eyes at the audience, signaling that this was going to be a waste of time. But then, something changed. The way Martha held her wrists shifted. Her shoulders dropped, losing their tense, hunched posture. She didn't look like a frightened cleaner anymore. She looked like she was listening to a song that only she could hear. Julian stopped rolling his eyes. He noticed the change in her demeanor. He straightened up a little, watching her hands more closely. The audience stopped giggling. A confused silence fell over the room. This didn't look like a joke anymore. Martha didn't strike the keys. She touched them gently, almost reverently. She was treating the machine with more respect than Julian ever had. She placed her fingers on the chords, ready to begin. The air in the room grew heavy with anticipation. Julian felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck, a sudden feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. The hotel ballroom was incredibly quiet. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a thick blanket has been thrown over a crowd. Earlier, the room had been filled with the sounds of clinking glasses, soft whispering, and polite laughter. But now, all of that had stopped. The only thing remaining was the hum of the air conditioning and the sound of breathing. Hundreds of people were sitting in the dark, their eyes fixed on the stage. They were waiting. They were expecting something funny to happen. They expected the woman in the blue uniform to stand up, say she couldn't play, and walk away so they could all laugh and go back to their drinks. Martha sat very still on the bench. She was a small woman with gray hair tied back in a bun, and she looked tiny next to the massive black grand piano. The piano was a shiny monster, much bigger than she was. Her feet were resting on the gold bar underneath the piano, but they didn't reach the pedals that control the sound. She looked out of place, like a child who had wandered onto a stage meant for adults. She kept her hands resting in her lap for a long time. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at Julian, the famous pianist who was standing a few feet away from her with his arms crossed. Julian was looking at his watch. He was tapping his foot on the floor very softly. He wanted to make a show of being impatient. He wanted the audience to see that he was waiting for this simple woman to fail so he could step in and save the day. He thought he was being very clever. He had a smirk on his face, the kind of look that says he knows a secret nobody else does. But as the seconds ticked by, Julian's foot stopped tapping. He looked up from his watch and glanced at Martha. She wasn't moving. She wasn't nervous like he thought she would be. She wasn't trembling. She was just sitting there, staring at the black and white keys. The audience started to get restless. A man in the front row coughed loudly. A few people shifted in their velvet seats. Someone whispered, "Is she going to play?" The silence was starting to feel awkward. It wasn't funny anymore, it was just strange. Julian raised his eyebrows at the crowd, as if to say, "See, I told you it would be silly." But then, Martha moved. She didn't move quickly. She moved very slowly, like an old person getting out of bed in the morning. She lifted her right hand and held it over the keys. Her hand didn't look graceful like Julian's hands. Her skin was rough and red from years of working with cleaning chemicals. Her knuckles were swollen, and her fingernails were short and practical. There were age spots on the back of her hand. It was a hand that had scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and carried heavy laundry baskets. It was a worker's hand. Julian saw her hand hovering over the piano. He leaned forward slightly, squinting his eyes. He was watching to see where her fingers would land. He expected her to hit a jumble of notes, a messy sound that would make everyone laugh. He was ready to shake his head and look disappointed. But Martha didn't hit the keys. She lowered her fingers gently, one by one. She didn't slap them down. She placed them on the keys with the kind of care you would use to touch a newborn baby or a fragile flower. The moment her fingers touched the ivory, the energy in the room shifted. It was a small thing, but everyone felt it. Martha's posture changed. She stopped looking like a frightened cleaner. She straightened her back just a little bit. She took a deep breath, and her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes lost their scared look. Instead, she seemed to look inward, as if she was remembering something very private and very old. She wasn't seeing the bright lights or the fancy people anymore. She was somewhere else in her mind. Julian uncrossed his arms. The smirk on his face began to fade. He sensed that something was different about the way she was sitting. Most people who are afraid to play piano hold their breath and stiffen their muscles. But Martha was letting her weight sink into the bench. She was comfortable. She looked like she belonged there. This confused Julian. He had played in thousands of concert halls, and he knew what fear looked like. This woman didn't look afraid. She looked peaceful. The audience held its breath. They could sense the change too. The whispers stopped completely. The man who coughed sat up straighter. The rich people in their diamond jewelry and silk ties stopped thinking about their money and their dinners. They were drawn to the small figure on the bench. There was a mystery there now. Why was this cleaning lady sitting so still? Why was she looking at the piano with such love? The cruel joke was forgotten. Now, they were just curious. Martha pressed down the first key. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a single, clear note that hung in the air. It was an E-flat. The tone was beautiful. It wasn't the harsh, banging sound of a beginner. It was a soft, singing note that seemed to vibrate in everyone's chest. Then, she played the next note. And then another. She wasn't playing a song anyone recognized immediately. It wasn't a pop song or a famous classical piece that everyone knew. It was a melody that sounded like a memory. It was sad but hopeful, like a bird flying in the winter sky. Julian stepped closer to the piano. He couldn't help himself. He needed to hear better. His eyes widened. He knew that sound. He knew that tone. You cannot teach someone to make a piano sound like that. You can practice for 10 hours a day for 20 years, but if the feeling isn't in your heart, the piano will just sound like wood and wire. But this woman was making the piano come alive. The notes were flowing out of her with an ease that shocked him. Her fingers, which looked so clumsy and rough, were moving with incredible grace. They were dancing over the keys, finding the perfect spots. She started to play a bit louder now. Her left hand began to add a deep, rolling rhythm. It was the sound of a heartbeat. The melody was simple, not flashy like the songs Julian played. He played songs that were full of fast notes and technical tricks to show off how fast his fingers could move. But Martha wasn't showing off. She was telling a story. Every note meant something. It was like she was having a conversation with the instrument. The music filled the huge room. It didn't feel aggressive. It felt like a warm embrace. The people in the back of the room stood up. They wanted to see better. They couldn't believe that the sound was coming from a woman in a cleaning uniform. The critics, the people who wrote about music for newspapers, put down their pens. They stopped writing about the lights and the expensive clothes. They just listened. They were hearing a kind of purity that they rarely heard in concert halls. This music wasn't about being perfect. It was about being human. It had flaws, tiny hesitations that made it sound even more real and beautiful. Julian stood frozen by the side of the piano. He felt a strange mix of emotions. He felt confused, because he didn't understand how a simple woman could play this way. He felt a little bit scared, because he realized that his own playing might be empty compared to hers. But mostly, he felt a strange sense of awe. He watched her swollen knuckles and her worn-out skin, and he realized that those hands had held a lot of sorrow and a lot of love. That was what was coming out of the piano. She wasn't playing notes, she was pouring her life into the music. Martha still hadn't looked at the crowd. Her eyes were closed now. A small smile played on her lips. She wasn't smiling at the audience. She was smiling at a memory. Maybe she was remembering her childhood home. Maybe she was remembering someone she loved a long time ago. The music was getting more complex. Her hands were crossing over each other, creating patterns of sound that were mesmerizing. The acoustics of the ballroom, usually designed for loud brass bands or grand orchestras, were perfectly suited for this quiet, intimate music. The sound bounced off the high ceilings and wrapped around the listeners like a soft fog. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the world outside the hotel had disappeared. There were no rich people and no poor people anymore. There was only the sound of the piano connecting them all. Even the waiters, who were standing in the shadows holding trays of drinks, had stopped moving to listen. They knew that this was a moment that would never happen again. Julian looked at his own hands. He looked at his long, slender fingers that had won so many awards. For the first time in his life, he felt embarrassed by them. They looked soft and weak compared to Martha's working hands. He realized that he played for fame and applause. He played to be the best. But Martha, she played for something else. She played because she had to. She played because the music was inside her and needed to get out. And as the melody grew sweeter and more intense, Julian knew that the joke he had planned had backfired completely. He hadn't made a fool of her. The situation was turning around, and he was the one who was about to learn a very big lesson. The melody that was flowing from the piano wasn't just random notes. It was a song that many people recognized, even if they hadn't heard it in a long time. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It is a famous piece, one that music students all over the world try to learn. But the way Martha was playing it was completely different from the way it is usually played in schools or concert halls. Most pianists play it to show off how fast they can move their fingers. They play the loud parts very aggressively and the soft parts very carefully, like they are ticking boxes on a list of things to do. But Martha wasn't doing that. She was playing it like she was whispering a secret to an old friend. As her right hand played the gentle, spinning melody, her left hand provided a steady, slow rhythm in the lower notes. It was the heartbeat of the song. The contrast between the two was beautiful. The high notes were like starlight, clear and bright, while the low notes were like the earth, deep and steady. The sound filled the huge ballroom, chasing away the cold, expensive atmosphere that had been there before. It was replaced by something warmer, something that felt real. Julian stood rooted to the spot, just a few feet away from the piano bench. He had crossed his arms when he first brought Martha up to the stage, but now his arms had dropped to his sides. His mouth was open just a little bit. He was a professional musician. He knew every single note of this song. He could probably play it with his eyes closed. But as he listened, he realized that Martha was playing notes that weren't written on the page. She was adding tiny pauses, holding a note just a fraction of a second longer than she was supposed to, speeding up slightly here and slowing down there. A music teacher would have called these mistakes. But listening to it, Julian knew they weren't mistakes. They were feelings. She was playing the emotion, not the metronome. He watched her face. It was incredibly peaceful. Her eyes were still closed, hiding her brown eyes from the bright lights. Her breathing was slow and steady, matching the rhythm of the music. A small, soft smile was on her lips. It wasn't a smile for the audience, it was a private smile, as if she was remembering a happy day from her childhood. She looked completely free. In her mind, she wasn't in a hotel ballroom wearing a rough uniform. She was back in her own living room, maybe 40 years ago, with the sunlight streaming through the window and no one to tell her she wasn't good enough. The audience was undergoing a transformation, too. At the back of the room, a group of young men who had been laughing and drinking heavily stopped talking. One of them was holding a glass of champagne halfway to his mouth, and he forgot to drink it. He just stared at the stage. Near the front, an elderly woman in a very expensive necklace reached into her purse and pulled out a handkerchief. She wasn't crying yet, but her eyes were misty. The music was reaching past their expensive clothes and their social status. It was touching something inside them that they usually kept hidden. It is a strange thing about live music. When someone plays with total honesty, it acts like a mirror. The people listening start to see their own lives in the melody. They thought about the loves they had lost, the dreams they had given up on, and the simple moments of happiness they had forgotten. The snobbish feeling that had filled the room earlier, the feeling that they were better than the cleaning lady, was evaporating. They were realizing that this woman, who they had laughed at, had more soul in her little finger than most of them had in their entire bodies. The song moved into a more complicated section. The melody became a little sadder, a little more searching. Martha's hands moved apart, her left hand going deep down the bass keys and her right hand climbing high into the treble. The sound swelled. It wasn't loud like a rock concert, it was a powerful wave of sound that washed over everyone. A man in a dark suit, who looked like a serious businessman, felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know why, but the music reminded him of his mother. He hadn't thought about her in years. Suddenly, he missed her terribly. Julian felt a pang of jealousy, but it was quickly washed away by something else, shame. He remembered all the times he had played this piece. He thought about the judges he had impressed, the trophies he had won, and the applause he had received. He realized now that he had been treating the piano like a machine. He used it to make noise that proved he was talented. But Martha was treating the piano like a living being. She was coaxing the sound out of it. She was listening to the instrument just as much as the audience was listening to her. There was a conversation happening between her hands and the strings inside the piano, and Julian was just a witness to it. Her technique was not perfect. If you looked closely with a microscope, you might see that her fingers weren't as flexible as they used to be. Her reach wasn't as wide as Julian's. But it didn't matter. The imperfections were what made the performance so heartbreaking. They made it human. They made it true. It was like a handmade vase with a tiny bump in it compared to a perfectly smooth factory-made one. The factory one is perfect, but the handmade one has a soul. Martha's music had a soul. The lights in the ballroom seemed to dim on their own, even though the technician hadn't touched the switches. The spotlight on Martha made her gray hair glow like a halo. The dust motes dancing in the light seemed to move in time with the music. The world outside the hotel, the traffic, the noise, the busy streets felt a million miles away. Inside this room, time had stopped. There was only the music. A young waiter, who was standing near the wall, leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He had grown up in a house where music was always playing, and this song reminded him of home. He felt a tear slide down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He wasn't embarrassed. Everyone else was feeling it too. The barrier between the important guests and the staff had melted away. There was just a group of humans, sharing a moment of beauty. Martha shifted slightly on the bench. She played a series of chords that cascaded down the keyboard like rain falling on a roof. It was a magical sound. It was delicate and precise. Julian shook his head slowly in disbelief. He knew how hard that passage was. He struggled with it sometimes. But she played it effortlessly. She didn't even look down. Her hands seemed to know exactly where to go. It was as if the piano was guiding her fingers. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow. This woman wasn't just a cleaner with a hidden hobby. She was a musician. She might have been a great musician if life had been different for her. Maybe she never had the money for lessons. Maybe she had to work to support her family instead of practicing scales. Maybe the world had just never given her a chance. But here, in this moment, she was proving that talent isn't about money or status. It is about what is in your heart. And her heart was full of music. The room was so quiet now that you could hear the soft squeak of the piano pedals as Martha finally reached out to press them with her foot. She had to stretch her leg to reach them, but she managed it. The sound of the piano changed, becoming softer and more blurred, like a watercolor painting. It was the most beautiful sound Julian had heard in years. He looked at the audience. They were spellbound. The critics were holding their breaths, afraid that if they breathed, the magic would stop. The joke was completely gone. No one was thinking about Julian or his cleverness anymore. They were only thinking about Martha. She played a phrase that hung in the air, vibrating with emotion. It was a sound that seemed to ask a question that had no answer. It was the sound of longing, of missing someone, of love that has no place to go. The music swelled one last time, filling every corner of the vast hall. It wrapped around the marble columns and floated up to the ceiling. And then, as the song reached its peak, Martha began to bring it back down. She started to guide the melody toward its end, slowing the pace, letting the notes drift away one by one, like leaves floating down a stream. The ending was approaching, and the entire room leaned in, desperate to catch every last second of it. As the music began to slow down, moving toward the end of the song, the feeling in the room changed from amazement to something much deeper. It felt like a heavy, quiet sadness, but the kind of sadness that is beautiful. Martha's hands were moving softly now, playing the final notes of the nocturne. The melody, which had been so full of life and energy just a moment ago, was fading away like a sunset. She played a delicate run of notes that trickled down the keyboard, light as water. It was so quiet that people in the back row were leaning forward in their seats, afraid to breathe too loudly and miss the sound. Then, with the gentle touch of a mother putting a blanket over a sleeping child, Martha played the final chords. They were simple and low. She didn't try to make them loud or dramatic. She just let them sound, deep and resonant, and then she lifted her hands off the keys. She placed her hands back in her lap and sat there. She did not stand up. She did not bow. She kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, as if she was saying a private thank you to the piano, or maybe to the memory she was holding in her heart. For a full 10 seconds, there was absolute silence in the ballroom. It was a heavy, thick silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody coughed. Nobody moved. The air seemed to be vibrating with the ghost of the music they had just heard. The contrast was shocking. Only a few minutes ago, these people had been ready to laugh at her. They had seen a cleaner in a blue uniform and thought she was nothing. Now, they felt like they had been in the presence of royalty. They felt small. The silence was finally broken by a sound from the back of the room. It was a sniffle. A man in the very last row, a big man with a gray beard who looked like a retired construction worker, was wiping his eyes with a rough sleeve. He stood up. He didn't clap loudly at first, he just stood there, looking at the stage with immense respect. He was followed by a woman near the front, a wealthy lady in a fur coat. She slowly rose to her feet, clutching her diamond necklace with one hand and wiping a tear with the other. Then, like a wave moving across the ocean, the entire room began to stand up. One by one, people rose from their velvet chairs. The waiters stopped serving and stood against the walls, clapping. The bartender put down his towel and clapped. The sound started soft, just a scattering of hands, and then it grew. It wasn't just polite clapping anymore. It was a roar. It was a thunderous, overwhelming noise that bounced off the high ceiling and the crystal chandeliers. People were shouting bravo. An encore. It was the kind of applause that is usually reserved for the biggest stars in the world, not for a hotel cleaner who had been dragged on stage as a joke. Martha opened her eyes. She looked surprised, almost confused, by the wall of sound coming at her. She looked out at the crowd, and for the first time, she really saw them. She saw the standing ovation. She saw the tears on their faces. She blushed deeply, turning a shade of red that went all the way to the roots of her gray hair. She didn't know how to react. She wasn't used to praise. She was used to being invisible, to working hard in the background while other people took the credit. She tried to cover her face with her hands, shy and embarrassed by all the attention. Julian, the famous pianist, was standing next to the piano. His face had lost all color. He was pale. He looked at the cheering crowd, and then he looked at Martha. The smirk was long gone. The arrogance had vanished. He felt terrible. He realized that he had tried to humiliate a woman who possessed more artistry in her little finger than he had in his whole career. He felt small. He felt like a bully who had been exposed. The applause was not for him. He knew that. If he walked on stage right now, people might even boo him. He had set a trap, but he was the one who had fallen into it. The audience wasn't cheering because it was a funny moment. They were cheering because they had been touched by something real. They had seen the raw truth, and it had shaken them. Julian realized that all his technical perfection, all his fast fingers and his fancy tuxedo, meant nothing compared to the soul Martha had just shown them. He played music with his brain. She played with her heart. Julian knew he had to do something. He had to fix this, not just for his own reputation, but because it was the right thing to do. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. He walked over to the piano bench where Martha was sitting. The crowd quieted down slightly, watching him. They wondered what he was going to do. Was he going to try to take the credit? Was he going to make another joke? Julian stopped in front of Martha. He bent down. He didn't just nod at her. He actually knelt on one knee on the stage, right in front of her. He was eye level with her now. The room went quiet again. Everyone watched. Martha looked at him, her eyes wide, unsure of what was happening. Julian reached out and gently took one of Martha's hands. It was the hand she had used to wipe tables and scrub floors all day. It was rough and warm. He held it with both of his hands, reverently, like it was a precious jewel. Then, in front of hundreds of people, in front of the cameras and the critics, Julian bowed his head and kissed the back of her hand. It was a gesture of total surrender. It was an ancient sign of respect, usually reserved for queens or princesses. By doing it, Julian was telling the whole world that he was the student and she was the master. He was admitting that he had been wrong. The audience let out a collective gasp. Then, the applause started again, even louder than before. People were cheering for Julian now, too, not for his music, but for his humility. They were cheering because they had just witnessed a very proud man humble himself before a very great soul. Martha looked like she wanted to pull her hand away. She was so shy. But Julian held it gently and looked up at her. His eyes were shining. He whispered something to her. No one else could hear what he said, but Martha smiled. It was a genuine, surprised smile that lit up her whole face. She squeezed his hand back. Julian stood up slowly. He kept hold of her hand and turned her toward the audience. He wanted everyone to see her. He wanted everyone to know who the real artist was. He raised their joined hands in the air. Martha was blushing furiously, looking down at her shoes, but she was smiling too. She looked out at the sea of faces and realized that for the first time in her life, people weren't looking through her. They were seeing her. They were seeing the music she had kept hidden inside her for so many years. A man in the front row, a well-known critic who was famous for writing harsh reviews, threw his notepad onto the floor. He didn't need to write anything down. He knew he had just witnessed the most important musical moment of his life. He clapped until his hands hurt. The woman in the fur coat was crying openly now, her makeup running down her face, not caring a bit about how she looked. Julian stepped back to the microphone. He paused for a long time, trying to find his voice. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaky. It wasn't the confident, booming voice he had used earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to play a joke tonight. But the joke was on me." He paused again and looked at Martha. "I have never heard anything more beautiful in my entire life. Thank you." He stepped away from the microphone and applauded her. The audience went wild. They were shouting her name. "Martha! Martha! Martha!" The sound was deafening. Martha stood up from the bench, her legs shaking a little. Julian steadied her. She gave a small, awkward curtsy. It wasn't a professional bow. It was the bow of a grandmother thanking a neighbor for a kind gesture. It was humble and sweet. The music was over, but the feeling in the room would last for a long time. The people in the audience walked out of that hotel ballroom feeling different. They walked out a little bit kinder, a little bit more aware of the people around them. They realized that you can't judge a book by its cover, and you certainly can't judge a musician by her uniform. And standing in the center of it all was Martha, a simple woman who had cleaned up the mess of the rich and famous for years, only to show them that she was the one with the real treasure all along. The cheering inside the ballroom did not stop quickly. It went on for a long time, wave after wave of sound crashing against the walls. Martha stood there for as long as she could, her face burning hot with embarrassment and surprise. She held onto Julian's hand for support, looking out at the crowd with wide eyes. She had never imagined she would be standing in a spotlight, with hundreds of rich people clapping for her. It felt like a dream, a strange and wonderful dream that she was terrified she would wake up from. But eventually, the noise began to die down. The people started to sit back down, though their eyes were still fixed on her. The moment was passing, and real life was waiting to come back in. Martha gently pulled her hand away from Julian. She didn't want to let go of the kindness, but she needed to get back to who she really was. She gave the audience one last, shy nod and a small, trembling smile. Then, she turned away from the microphone and the bright lights. She walked slowly across the stage, her walking shoes making soft thuds on the wood. She didn't walk toward the exit where the celebrities would leave. She walked toward the dark corner where she had left her work. She picked up her feather duster and her cleaning cloth. The rough fabric felt familiar in her hands. It felt like reality. When she turned back around, the contrast was heartbreakingly beautiful. She was standing in her simple blue uniform with her cleaning supplies in her hand, while the grand piano sat gleaming behind her. She looked like a magical fairy who had suddenly turned back into a regular person. The audience watched her go, and many of them felt a lump in their throats. They wanted to rush up and talk to her, to ask her about her life, to tell her how she made them feel. But they stayed in their seats. They knew that the moment was too sacred to ruin with noisy chatter. Julian watched her walk away too. He felt a strange emptiness in his chest, but it was a good kind of emptiness. He felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off his shoulders. For years, he had carried around the pressure of being the best, of being perfect. He realized now that he had been playing for himself, to prove he was better than everyone else. But Martha had played for the music itself. She had played for love. Standing there, still feeling the vibration of her music in the air, Julian made a quiet promise to himself. He promised that he would never look down on anyone again. He promised that from now on, he would try to play with his heart, not just his hands. Martha walked down the steps from the stage and onto the marble floor. As she moved through the tables, the atmosphere shifted. The people sitting near the aisle didn't ignore her this time. They didn't look through her. A younger man stood up as she passed. He didn't say anything, he just nodded his head deeply, a sign of total respect. An older woman reached out and gently touched Martha's arm as she went by. "Thank you," the woman whispered. Her voice was full of emotion. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." Martha stopped and looked at her. She saw the tears in the woman's eyes and smiled gently. "Thank you for listening," Martha said softly. Her voice was raspy and quiet, very different from the powerful voice of the piano. She didn't stay to talk. She didn't want to make a scene. She just wanted to finish her shift. She continued walking through the ballroom, but she moved differently now. She didn't shuffle her feet. She didn't try to shrink into the background. She walked with her head up, carrying the dignity of the music with her. She went back to the wooden cabinet in the corner where she had started. It felt like a lifetime ago that she was dusting that cabinet, trying to be invisible. She picked up her cloth and started wiping the wood again. The motion was the same: wipe, 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 but she felt different inside. Her hands, which had played such beautiful music only minutes ago, went back to the humble work of cleaning. But now, the work didn't feel like a burden. It felt quiet and peaceful. She realized that she didn't need a fancy stage or a tuxedo to be a musician. The music was inside her, and no amount of cleaning or scrubbing could take that away. As she worked, she could hear the buzz of the room. People were leaving their tables and gathering in small groups. The conversations were different now. They weren't talking about stock markets or expensive vacations. They were talking about what they had just heard. "Did you see her hands?" one man whispered. "They looked so rough, but they moved like water." "I haven't cried in 20 years, a woman said to her friend. "But that song made me remember my mother." They were realizing something important. They were realizing that talent and soul don't come from money or status. You can buy a ticket to a concert, but you can't buy the kind of emotion Martha had shared with them. She had given them a gift, a reminder of what it means to be human and to feel deeply. Outside the ballroom, in the lobby of the hotel, the night was continuing. But the word was spreading fast. Waiters ran back to the kitchen to tell their colleagues. People took out their phones and posted messages online, describing the miracle they had just witnessed. It wasn't a scandal or a disaster, it was a moment of pure joy. The story would travel far. People would share the story of the cleaner who shocked a famous pianist and humbled a room full of rich people. Eventually, the event organizers turned the lights back up in the ballroom. The spell was officially broken. The waiters began to clear the glasses. The band came back to play some light background music, but it sounded hollow and fake compared to what Martha had played. Julian Thorne packed up his sheet music. He didn't rush. He moved slowly, thoughtfully. Before he left the stage, he went over to the piano one last time. He touched the keys gently, imagining Martha's hands resting there. He didn't play a note. He just closed the lid carefully, as if he were closing a book on a lesson he had just learned. Before he left the hotel, Julian asked one of the staff members to find out Martha's full name. He didn't want her to disappear into the shadows again without knowing who she was. He wrote her name down on a piece of paper and put it in his pocket. He knew he couldn't just walk away and forget this night. He wanted to make sure she got the recognition she deserved. He didn't know how he would do it yet. Maybe he would help her record a song, or maybe he would just buy her a better piano. But he knew their lives had touched, and he was grateful. For Martha, the night ended quietly. When the ballroom was finally empty, she clocked out and got her coat. She walked out of the hotel through the back entrance, the way she always did. The cool night air hit her face, feeling fresh and clean. The city sounds were loud, cars honking, sirens wailing, but it all seemed like music to her now. She walked toward the bus stop, her purse over her shoulder. Her feet were a little tired from standing on the stage, but her heart was light. She looked up at the stars for a moment, blinking away a tear of happiness. She thought about her husband, who had passed away years ago. She wished he could have been there to hear her play. But as she waited for the bus, she felt like he was with her. She felt like he was smiling down, proud of the simple woman who had found her voice for a few short minutes. Martha got on the bus when it came. It was late, and there were only a few people on it. She sat in her usual seat near the window. No one on the bus knew who she was. They just saw an older woman in a blue uniform coming home from work. They didn't know that she was the person who had brought a famous hotel to a standstill. They didn't know her hands could create magic. And that was okay with Martha. She didn't need their applause. She had already proven to herself that she was more than just a cleaner. She was an artist. She leaned her head against the cold glass of the window and watched the city lights go by. A small smile played on her lips as the music played on in her mind, softer now, but still there. It was a song she would keep forever, a secret treasure that belonged only to her.